Welcome, listeners. It's a good moment to bridge a concept that gives credence to a lot of the psychoanalytic conversation that permeates society. And I think touching upon the subject from a different point of view is always a worthwhile endeavor. I call this concept therapeutic mending, but in truth, it's simply something that is therapeutic just for the sake of being therapeutic. It's what you would find on Google as top 10 therapeutic practices. It is not the theory of psychology or an abstract version of understanding the psyche. It's simply the process in which one will be able to connect two interactive parts of the psyche. There's conflict that arises in the psyche. It's something that comes about through the confusion of dealing with multiple affairs, different orientations, different frameworks, different relationships. And they all come together to create conflict. And the solution, or we could say the resolution for this conflict, is by mending those interactive pieces so that they create a unified whole. Now, we first have to understand why this becomes a necessity for a higher life form or to develop a progressed individual. Like, why is this a necessity? Why is this a need of individuals? Is it a display of the corruption of society or corruption of, I don't know, the belief system or other frameworks? And I really think that if you study the history, especially the history from civilization going forward, we see that every culture had a different version of this concept of creating a space where the conflict, the interpersonal conflict, and the personal conflict within oneself is found to be resolute without any serious theory or conversation that backs that connection. It matters because it's quite contradictory to the rational framework or any sort of logical assumptions that the mind needs a sort of mechanism to provide its own functionality, as if the mind is somehow faulted. And we come to the modern, savior and say that we could fix this by doing these processes. And to make matters worse, it's always the fringe of a culture that's pursuing this, sometimes more than it's needed. And because of this, the fringe, because of their natural attributes as being the fringe group, the entire concept gets this bad rap. But we have to realize that we don't have to do anything, but it would be imperative to realize that the mind is not a perfected machine. As much as we need that sacred perspective of the mind and of the body for certain endeavors, and it's required for different situations and especially different stages of life. But it's not to say that that's the fundamental truth. And if we see that there is something that's lacking of the mind, something that's fairly dysfunctional, and it could be the attribute of the environment, but then we're just attributing the environment to be a dysfunctional entity. Either way, someone is going to get the blame. And therapeutic mending, where the mind needs to heal, meaning the mind cannot function on its own without healing. without, meaning the body could go a full lifetime without the necessity of healing, or the healing process goes without the conscious endeavor, without it doing anything to fix it. But when it comes to the mind, there is a requirement to create a bond of parts that the mind cannot conjure on its own, and is dependent on a conscious activity for this. And so the historical perspective on this is either prayer, a ritualistic gathering of connection, any sort of bondage ritual, which, if we're going to understand ritual in its proper sense, then ritual is the things that we do that are not logically concocted, but rather are needed despite logicality. But either way, we come to the new age, let's call it, or the more complex psyche, and it becomes a fairly important tool that's needed on a daily basis. Because of the complexity of the mind, the tools that necessitate to enjoy and create that complexity are going to have to step it up in its nuanced layers. It's going to need to take heed of its development. So if prayer was worthwhile of an endeavor in history for, some scattered parts of the psyche that are not part of a complex system, so simple mending of months at a time will be enough. But when there is a complex psyche, one cannot go 2 days without mending the complexity. But let's return to the talking point at hand, which is, what is therapeutic mending? So I want to walk away from the theory of therapeutic mending, like the things that all of therapy are associated with, but rather the external mechanisms that help assist the scattered psyche, as we call it, to come together, not through dialogue, as in the psychoanalytical process, not through relationship or behavior, but really through allowing a space or a realm of healing to endure, to create the bondage. Now, the reason that there's no logicality to this, the rational mind is opposed to such an endeavor, is because it doesn't make sense that in an individual is a singularity, and especially it doesn't make sense that some scattered parts of the psyche are somehow connected. Like of something so dormant, something so infantile, to connect to something so complex at a later stage of life. Now, what does those two episodes, those two experiences have in common? And the rational mind is seeking to mend it in a more dynamical process of, okay, so where does this fit into that? How do we fit the puzzle pieces? But this is like superseding the puzzle pieces. This is saying, like, despite that, we're just going to put them together and make them one. Now, it seems like we're circumventing the whole development of the natural order of things, like giving answers and creating a sequence. But the truth of the matter is that there's no amount of intellectual material that could connect two distinct episodes, because they were built on a different intellectual framework. At most, they could dynamically understand each other. Like at most, two people could see each other's view, but never can they become the single perspective, because then they lose the two sides of that view. And so this sort of singularity, this therapeutic mending is meant to do, we find to be against all rationality, but it is a procedure that could happen, meaning we could do it. Nothing is stopping us from saying, okay, whether it makes sense or not to forgive, whether it makes sense or not to fulfill the questions by simply mending them, we're going to do it, and it will be done. If it's performed properly, it will be done. Now, once the mending process has culminated, this is the important subject, and in much deviation, this is where the attribute of the fringe group that we discussed in the beginning, the fringe group who gets that association of constantly mending, this is where they get the bad rap from, in which there's an assumption that that singularity is the truth, meaning, yeah, all of my experience, all of nature, it's all one beautiful thing. And so that's perfect. I'm done. I've culminated. But the truth is that we cannot agree with that, because there is an intellectual separation. Although we mended it properly, doesn't mean that it hasn't saw itself in its distinct parts in some form. Like there is some separation. Now, at the moment, there's this complete convergence in the emotional sphere. But in the intellectual sphere, we take somebody, right, who gets to a point of forgiveness, right? They're in the deep state of forgiveness, or in the deep state of grief, where they've reached a place of true integration. And we begin to start a discussion based on the distinct aspects that were previously separated. And we start to talk about the person that they've hated or had or missed, and we start bringing that about. Right away, the psyche is going to separate. There's going to be intellectual sides. The entire experience of that mending process seems to fade away, and we're back to square one. Because the truth of the matter is, this is a cycle that we never solve. It can only have the effect of, in the intellectual sphere, of gaining as much as possible to dynamically understand each side without opposing each point of view. And in the emotional sphere, to mend the two sides. Now, once both the intellectual sphere has reached that dynamical inference and the emotional sphere has reached that mending space, it is highly suspect that any emotional material would arise or ascend with strong degree based on that, intrusion that we put upon them. But it's still, there is something distinct. Let's say, for example, we matured, right? So we have this infantile stage in us. And so it's there and it's separate. Now, we could say that the mature side of us has seen the entire infantile state. And the infantile state has, looked upon the mature state, or we've understood the infantile state in perceiving the possible mature stage. And so they're dynamically they're understood. And as well, we've mended the process. We went back and forth and we regressed. We put them together in an emotional sphere in the therapeutic mending process. And so now what we have is distinct entities. We're always going to have that stage of infantileness. But it's not something that would, if somebody came over to us and started to mention like, oh, you're really just a child, you're really infantile, or you're not as mature as you say you are, it shouldn't arise much emotion. And maybe it would create some intellectual questions like where are they coming from? Where is this? Maybe it's almost like we're ready. Okay, so maybe I'm either way, and so that's that. But it's almost like we've reached the conclusion despite the distinctiveness of the two sides. Now, therapeutic mending would only circumvents the emotional interactive material. But as long as there's an intellectual question, right? There's two sides that haven't seen each other properly in a true dynamical fashion. The interactive friction is going to come again and again and again. For example, the period of grief, right? If we bombard them with, bringing the separate parts, the parts of themselves that are stuck between the individual and themselves, they're going to lose that space of mending and go back to a place of disparity. And it will continue to happen over and over again, despite the experiences of mending through the mourning process. But what does come about that is that eventually the intellectual material is going to be so stalwart in its sides that the interactive material that comes about it doesn't need to be mended. And so the mending process is only there, meaning you had a long day, you sit back to some music, and hence there's therapeutic mending going on or whatever. If that wasn't dealt with intellectually, then it will be a perpetual cycle of mending those therapeutic instances so that you become a singularity, you become a single person that could function in the present moment. Excuse me. But at the same time, you don't. It will come about again because intellectually things were not solved. And so we're at a place where we need to recognize the frailty of therapeutic mending. And I would say that's where Freud and the pioneers in psychoanalytic theory have really emphasized, is that it is a dialogical process between parts of the psyche that need to be mended intellectually. But at the same time, they failed or neglected to talk about the day-to-day therapeutic process of mending so that you could function today as if you are a single individual and not stuck in that conflict. And so I hope this sheds some insight on the topic. And I think we've fairly just scratched the surface of it, and there's so much more to discuss upon it, especially in how this manifests socially and whatnot. Thanks for listening, guys.